Hello and welcome back. This is Transmedia Storytelling from Mythology to Marvel, Lecture 11. This one goes to 11. Multiple experience pathways and modularity. So, a vast narrative franchise requires experience pathways for audiences to follow. This is the same stuff I talked about at the very beginning of this class, where we were looking at the little blue arrows that would connect the tie-in movies and the comics and the video games back into the original feature films of the Matrix trilogy, and so on and so on. Basically, if you start thinking about these kinds of tie-in components as extensions, right, as side quests to the main story, and you start thinking about how to connect them together back into the original storyline with those little blue arrows, how do you do that? Right? How do you do that in the text? It's easy to understand this whole meta experience of discover, collect, consume, react, but when it comes time to actually building it into your story, uh, how do you do it? How do you make it work? Well, this is how. You basically look for these kinds of opportunities to include negative spaces or mysteries and things you can build into your stories. And by mentioning these sort of external people, places, and things, building these negative spaces into your story, you start to create opportunities for your audiences to explore. Now, the problem is, just like we've talked about with the Matrix, if you over rely on that, you can start to alienate your audience. It stuff starts to feel like too much work, right? So, this is why you also need to keep in mind a particular sense of modularity, which is that each individual piece of your franchise is going to inherently be somebody's first point of contact into that story world, and they need to deliver enough of a sufficiently awesome experience on their own that they don't feel radically incomplete. They don't feel dissatisfying, right? So we'll get back to that in the second half of this talk. Now, I am, as I've told you repeatedly, a recovering English and philosophy major as an undergrad, and so when I started looking at negative spaces as a core characteristic of transmedia story worlds, I landed on this, right? So this is John Keats from 1817, 200 years ago. He was looking at this particular stuff. He said, "I had not the dispute, but a disquisition with Dilke on various subjects. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason." Right? So if you think about mysteries on the page as a negative space, right? So the term negative space is very frequently used in art, visual art, paintings, things like that, where a painter will include a particular negative space in the composition of the original work in order to either draw attention to what is there or to draw attention to what is not, right? So that by incorporating this kind of empty space, kind of like the rests in a piece of music, right? That is itself a part of the composition. Now, if you have the negative spaces, then the capacity for the human imagination to fill in those gaps with some kind of working data, so to speak, that's negative capability, right? That's the capacity of the human imagination to fill in the gaps are left by negative spaces. So, my favorite example of this is Boba Fett. I told you before I was born in '77, so that means that when I was a little kid running around on playgrounds, we were playing Star Wars, right? And so me and my friends, I was a huge Droids fan, and my friend, another friend, was a huge Monster fan, and another friend of ours just happened to be a girl, and all three of us were fascinated by Boba Fett, right? This was back before all the prequels told us who Boba Fett was. We had never heard of Jango Fett. We had barely heard the term Mandalorian, right? Instead, all we knew is that there was this really killer-looking character running around in this badass set of armor with this rocket on his back, and he was awesome. Right, the guy was legendary in the Star Wars universe. You know, Darth Vader looks at him and says, "No disintegrations." Right, ooh, this character was fascinating, and we knew nothing about him, which meant that because I was a huge Droids fan, I thought that Boba Fett was a robot under that helmet. And my friend that thought that he was a monster thought that he was some, drooling, disgusting alien under the helmet. And my other friend, who happened to be a girl, thought that Boba Fett was actually Han Solo's long-lost sister, right? And until those prequels came out, some 20-odd years later, we were all right because our imaginations were able to customize that mystery for our own individual tastes, right? Now there's a catch to this, which says that if you're not careful, then the mystery that you present is going to overpower the answer that you will eventually provide. But we'll get back to that in a minute. This is very closely related to another storyteller's trick. So imagine you're in a horror story right now, and there's this awful scratch, scratch, scratch outside the door. If you're afraid of spiders, until that door is opened, it's a 12-foot spider on the other side of that door. And if you're afraid of wolves, until that door is opened, it is a 20-foot slobbering wolf on the other side of that door. And if you're afraid of plumbers, it's a 60-foot Mario trying to get in the other side of that door, right? So the point here is that our imaginations customize our experiences for us with the best possible versions for each and every one of us, right? So, as storytellers, we can load our worlds, load our stories with these kinds of external references to people, places, and things that aren't really there in the main story. And just through simple lines of dialogue, like, many Bothans died to bring us this information, our imaginations go nuts. Right? And they start customizing these stories to our own individual tastes. Now, the problem with that is what happens when those answers are provided and they don't measure up to what we had thought. So, in my experience and my diligent research, the original Star Wars trilogy kicks the prequels trilogy's ass in this regard, because if you go and you watch the original trilogy, there's all these mentions of these people, places, and things that make that world feel huge. So the original, like, I fought your father in the Clone Wars, many Bothans died to bring us this information. When Obi-Wan refers to a lightsaber as a more elegant weapon for a more elegant age, things like that. When there are mentions of the Old Republic, like these are references to big, vast areas of time and space that make us like just wonder as to all this stuff that we don't know. However, when Lucas came back in the prequels, he didn't do that. There are very, very few mentions of external people, places, and things. There are very, very few negative spaces in the prequel trilogy. Instead, what there are a ton of answers, including a shload of answers that we didn't want, right? I mean, when Lucas introduced Boba Fett and Jango Fett, right? Introduced Jango Fett as the model, the template, the genetic source for where all these clone troopers came from, and then told us that that Boba Fett was the one untampered with clone that he could raise as his own son, right? Not a bad story. It's pretty good. But for me, it wasn't a droid, and for my other friend, it wasn't a monster, and for my other friend, it wasn't Han Solo's sister. And because it had been 20 years since we had come up with these answers for ourselves, those had become our own personal, like, headcanon, right? It was what our version of Star Wars was. And when Lucas came back with his canonical version of Star Wars, it didn't measure up to us. There had been too much time that had passed for us to fall in love with our own versions of it. So, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to introduce stuff that is opportunities for imagination. The second thing you've got to do is when you deliver those answers, it's got to be just orthogonal enough or just surprising enough that it's better than what we would have imagined ourselves. So remember that like 12-foot spider on the other side of the door? If you're afraid of spiders, and I as the storyteller said, you open the door and there's a spider! Well, it better be a pretty damn impressive spider for it to be better than the 12-foot one that you had in your head. If I just say, it's a 14-foot spider, you might be like, oh, that's slightly better than the 12-foot version I had in my head. But that's where you got to get creative, right? Because if I say, you open the door, and on the other side is a spider with the head of a baby, and the baby's eyes are glittering black with like faceted jewels staring at you, and then the spider says, Mama, right? That's creepy. So So how do you start to load that kind of stuff into your stories? So that you introduce mysteries and then you introduce payoffs that are surprising, that are rewarding, right? And ideally, that will be loaded with that same kind of additive comprehension stuff we talked about before, that it changes how you understood the original movies or the original source properties. Um, and I've just ranted about the failures of the prequel here for a good 5 minutes. But the ultimate failure is the midichlorians, right? There is a point at which you can start to answer questions that are at the very center of your story world. The existence of the Force as this magical thing that binds us together. When Lucas introduced the midichlorians, he suddenly pivoted from a world of magic, swords and sorcery, into a world of science. And suddenly, Star Wars became more of a hard science fiction story, and basically everybody that I know that watched those movies went, oh, like, don't do that. Don't violate your own unique franchise characteristics, your own unique story world rules, by answering mysteries that are way better off left unanswered. Right? You may need to know those answers, and for a lot of the exercises you're doing here in this class, you do need to sketch out some of those answers so that if you're introducing a mystery in one thing, then you have to point to where it's going to be answered in something else in the overall plan. But sometimes, those answers are just not things that your audience is ever going to want. And when they do get answered, they're going to have to be epic and awesome. Anyway, another way to do this, or to do this in a very additive, very improving way. Twilight. Oh, God, Twilight. So, y'all know me pretty well by now. I like me some monsters. I went to go see Twilight under duress. The original Twilight movie is about a sulky emo girl and her twinkly boyfriend. Um, Speaking as somebody that loves Dracula, that loves the Bram Stoker novel, and understanding that Dracula was really a commentary on the kind of rampant xenophobia that was in England at the time, as it was struggling with immigration issues, right? Like, Dracula as a fear of the other is more timely now than any of us are comfortable to admit. But I digress. The That kind of subtext really wasn't there in Twilight, and as a result, to me, Twilight felt spectacularly shallow. And that started to change when I was also forced under duress to watch New Moon. New Moon introduced the conflict between the werewolves and the vampires, and introduced this deep, rich backstory between those groups of people. It was world building, right? It introduced more central deviations and more reactions to those central deviations, and it made me really curious as to what was going on with these vampires and these werewolves. And so, with that introduction, with that additional complication, it made that world much more interesting, much more engaging to a broader audience. The original Twilight was apparently, and obviously, super duper appealing to that particular teenage girl demographic. But once you start getting into New Moon, that brought that potential audience for this thing broadened beyond that original core demographic, to, well, to get completely stereotypical, all the boyfriends that were dragged along to see those movies. Anyway, so if you think about these kinds of negative spaces, these external people, places, things, as off-ramps on the highway to other areas to explore, this is where the actual integration of this stuff into your story at a sentence level starts to appear, right? So mentioning the Clone Wars in a line of dialogue in Star Wars, opens up a vast area of space to explore. Same thing goes by mentioning the Old Republic, or to incorporate things like prophecies to hint at where that world is going in the future, right? Introducing different eras of time in your story worlds can lay the groundwork and to seed the fields for huge amounts of future exploration and expansion, like we've already talked about with the Clone Wars. Another thing to think about is how your different characters are going to be designed in such a way that they can support their own spin-offs. So we've talked before about the mentor's journey and the sidekick's journey, and so on and so forth. But some franchises, do this spectacularly well. It's not just the Avengers, where you have a bunch of protagonists that are then brought together into one like super crossover movie like the Avengers, right? Um, if you start to create your secondary characters in such a way that they themselves have their own embedded journeys to go on, then you're basically laying the groundwork, for those characters to have their own spin-offs. So Buffy the Vampire Slayer did this spectacularly well. Um, Buffy's romantic interest in the very early seasons was this vampire named Angel, and the idea was he was a vampire with a soul, which itself was again a deviation from that show's original principal deviation from reality, right? So if you have vampires as these soulless monsters, how do you get one that still has a soul, and what does that do? That's a good story hook. So that meant that by adding that additional little bit of character detail and adding a significant amount of hinted at history for that vampire that had been alive for centuries, Joss Whedon was introducing this character that could and did, lead his own spin-off show. So the very first spin-off for Buffy the Vampire Slayer was Angel. Um, then other characters that were introduced, again, were pretty well developed. Instead of just being there to act as the person that gives the hero the sword, right? They had their own journeys to go on. They had their own internal conflicts. And so Spike was another vampire who was much more monstrous, but eventually wound up going on a similar character journey to Angel. And Spike got his own spin off in comics much later on. Willow, Buffy's best friend, wound up going on her own journey of discovery as she discovered that she was not only a witch but also a lesbian, right? And so she was also enough of a fan favorite and a wonderful character that she got her own spinoff in comics again years later. So location is another way to think about this. If you start building your locations in your story world as deep and rich and having their own history and having their own unique characteristics to them, then those particular locations can spin stories for literally generations. Some of the longest running stories in pop culture are built around places, right? So if you look at soap operas, things like General Hospital, ER, the Dallas, right? Knots Landing, going back to some of these other things, Riverdale in more recent terms. These particular locations, can have all kinds of casts of characters, passing through them over the decades. Back at Microsoft, Alan Wake was this sort of a video game riff on Twin Peaks. Again, another good location-based story. But the story, the video game, 3, 2, 1. The story in the video game begins when Alan Wake, this writer, arrives in this eerie town of Bright Falls up in the Pacific Northwest, and the sort of Lovecraftian horror begins to unfold. What we did for this promotional webisode series leading up to the release of Alan Wake was we created this live action show that was set in Bright Falls that introduced a bunch of the secondary characters that Alan Wake would meet. Alan Wake himself never showed up in Bright Falls, the show. Instead, what it was doing was introducing audiences to that world and making them more emotionally attached to those secondary characters in that town, so that when they showed up in the game, it was oh hey, how you doing kind of a moment. And then when they met their untimely ends, it became that much more tragic. Again, good examples here of additive comprehension, and for how watching that original Bright Falls webisode series really did transform the amount of emotional depth and weight that you would have encountering those characters in the game itself. So another kind of trajectory, another experience pathway for people to follow is the artifact, right? So again, let's go back to the basics here. If you look at experience pathways as off ramps from the main highway, so to speak, so if you have the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the characters that are going to carry their own spin-offs, the audiences will follow those characters into their own spin-offs by dint of their being so well developed. You're creating an experience pathway for somebody to go from the original TV show off into the spin-off shows, right? That's what that experience pathway is. It is a designed experience as a path for audiences to follow from one medium into another. Another way to look at this is through artifacts, right? So The Red Violin is an anthology movie that follows this remarkable red violin from its original creation and then down through the generations from owner to owner. This is all done in one movie, but you could certainly unpack that design and have a particular legendary artifact get passed from owner to owner throughout an entire vast story world. They did this in Buffy the Vampire Slayer with this thing called the Scythe, right? So this red axe looking thing with a stake at its foot, right? This became this legendary weapon of the Slayers, the vampire killers, of which Buffy is the most recent. But the Scythe appears in or long ago stories, when it was first originated. But then it also appears in this spin-off comic called Fray, which is set in the future of that particular story world. So Joss Whedon, because he did all of this stuff, set it up so that that particular artifact could be followed from generation of Slayer to another as its own particular experience pathway. You see the same thing with He-Man's sword in Masters of the Universe. The sword is originally forged by King Grayskull and passed down to He-Man, and then passed on into future generations to this guy Hero, who's become the son of He-Man in the future. Oh, and another one that I didn't put in here, but I probably should have, is Luke Skywalker's lightsaber. We talked about it in an earlier lecture, but to go from Anakin Skywalker to Luke Skywalker to Rey, right? That is another excellent experience pathway. Now, going back to this notion of modularity, right? It's crucial to design these things so that they fit together to make up something that's greater than the sum of their parts, right? This gets back to Henry's definition of transmedia storytelling as being additive, right? With each new component making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole. However, the flip side of that is that because every individual piece is going to be somebody's first experience with the franchise, it cannot feel so reliant on the rest of the story world that it itself feels incomplete to the point that it's dissatisfying. You want to create your stories to be modular so that they are still sufficiently awesome on their own to inspire people to go out and experience more of it. Every component of your story, including every experience pathway, has to tell a good story. Now, this is the model that I put together for Spook Show. You will find this in the sample documents, and I'm asking you to make one of these yourselves for using PowerPoint and the materials provided that is going to sketch out how the pieces of your transmedia story will stitch together. Okay? So, what you see going along the top of this thing is you see where it says Sat 1, Wed 2, or Sat 1, Wed 1, Sat 2, Wed 2. The whole design for Spook Show was that new episodes would be dropped on Saturdays and Wednesdays. I was really getting into this cadence of there being effectively a Saturday morning cartoon that would be released, and then every Wednesday, which is New Comic Book Day, there would be some new print book that would be released. So that would either be a new issue of a comic book, or there would be a new issue of a tie-in novel or an e-book released, right? So what you then see are books, animation, and comics going down the left. The animation is in the middle with that gray bar going through it, because that to me is the tent pole, right? And then the books and the comics are both the expansions, the ancillary media. So you can see the blue arrows. The dark blue arrow from 1928-01 to 1921-01, that is the author's preferred experience pathway, to go from the animation into the comic, into an animation into a book, back into an animation, back into a comic, and so on and so forth. And that pattern repeats, right? You will also see these light blue arrows that connect 1928-01 to 1928-02 to 1928-03, from 1917-01 to 1917-02 to 1917-03, and 1921-01, 1921-02, 1921-03. Those light blue arrows are alternative experience pathways. What I'm inferring here is that an audience can just watch the cartoons, they can just read the books, they can just read the comics, or they can have a better experience if they stitch them all together in the sort of author's preferred pattern, right? Now, what's a little harder to see is that those dotted lines that go down from the top all the way down into those boxes at the bottom, So those each one of these things has a description below, right? So 1928-01, if you follow that dotted line all the way from Sat 1 down to 1928-01, next to the great Casey Smith there, where it says the show and the sisters, this is a synopsis for what happens inside of that episode. So, in the same way that we have books, animation, and comics, describing the media at the top, The Great Disaster, The Great Casey Smith, and The Great Wilderness, oh, geez, sorry about the line break, are themselves descriptions of those other pathways, right? So I've basically created these three interconnected sub franchises that follow either this event of the Great Disaster and what happens during that main time period, or the main character in the animation, the Great Casey Smith, or explorations into the place, right? So the Great Wilderness is a series. It's like an anthology series of these stories that are taking place in that particular part of that world, right? So each of these things, you can see the main storyline is character driven. The tie-in books are mostly like stories that are related to that particular event in that particular time period, and the Great Wilderness is related to a particular location, right? So these are three different types of expansion, as described earlier in the lecture. So, what I'm asking you to do is to look at your particular story worlds and start to plot out in a map like this one which media you're going to use. So, this is the media mix, right? Are you going to do a combination of video games, TV shows, and comic books? Are you going to do a mix of comic books, alternate reality games, and clothing? Are you going to do a mix of food and novels and dog shows? It's up to you, right? But as you start to plan out, what this flow from one medium into another, and then how those different stories are going to interconnect, this is how you can do it. This is how you can do it at a high level and sketch out that kind of a map. So, thank you very much for listening. We'll talk more about the unique affordances and how to choose what media you're going to use in our upcoming lectures. I'll see you next time.